If there is one thing that really makes me sick, it is watching people pretend to be noble. I am Sophie Allen, and this press conference is the phoniest thing I have ever seen. In the front row are my parents, the same hypocrites who threw me away at 14 because a fortune teller said I was cursed. Now that my father is dying, suddenly I am not a curse. I am a cure. It is enough to make you laugh if it wasn't so goddamn depressing. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spend here with us. The lights are bright, but the truth is about to get much darker. The humidity in the green room was precisely 45% a standard, regulated by the hotel's central HVAC system, yet I could feel sweat beating at the nape of my neck. It was a physiological betrayal, a primitive response to the cortisol flooding my bloodstream, and I detested it. I stood before the full-length vanity mirror, smoothing the lapels of my white lab coat. It was not just a garment. It was armor. It was a sterile barrier between Sophie Allen, the terrified 14-year-old girl who still lived somewhere in my hippocampus, and Dr. Sophie Allen, the lead geneticist for Etheris. Beyond the heavy velvet curtains, the grand ballroom hummed with the distinct low-frequency vibration of 1,000 waiting people. Investors, medical ethics boards, pharmaceutical rivals, and the ravenous global press, they were all there to see the woman who had allegedly killed the unkillable beast, hemolytic degeneration type 4, HDT4, a rare genetic executioner that turned the body's own plasma into a corrosive agent. It was a horrific way to die, dissolving from the inside out. I knew the symptoms better than anyone. I had watched my father scream in agony from the early stages of it 20 years ago, back when I was still allowed to call him Dad. I adjusted my glasses, checking my reflection for cracks in the facade. My face was composed, my makeup minimal but authoritative. I looked like a scientist. I looked like a savior. I certainly didn't look like a bad omen. The irony was a bitter pill I dissolved under my tongue daily. The very man whose genetics had cursed him with this disease had thrown me away because he believed I was the sickness. The memory didn't wash over me like a wave. It hit me with the precision of a scalpel triggered by a poster hanging on the opposite wall of the green room. It was a corporate motivational poster Etheris had put up. Family is the DNA of community. I stared at the word family, and the green room dissolved. I was 14 again. The smell of antiseptic hospital cleaner mixed with the cloying, suffocating scent of burning sage. We weren't at a hospital, though. We were in the living room of our estate in Connecticut. My mother, Elena, was pacing her silk robe, trailing behind her like the tail of an agitated cat. My father, David, sat in his armchair, his skin already gray and papery, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. And then there was Madame Hecate. I remembered her chipped nail polish and the way she looked at the expensive furniture with hungry eyes. She wasn't a doctor. She was a grifter my mother had found in a strip mall, a woman who claimed to speak to spirits but mostly spoke to bank accounts. "It is the girl," Hecate had said, pointing a crooked finger at me. I was huddled in the corner holding my math textbook, trying to be invisible. Her aura is inverted. She is a psychic vampire. Every breath she takes drains two from the father. As long as she is under this roof, the medicine will fail. She is the curse. I had laughed. I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. I was an honor roll student. I volunteered at the library. I loved my father more than anything. but nobody else laughed. I looked at my brother Mark, who was 11 then. He was sitting on the rug playing with a game console, oblivious, basking in the golden glow of being the safe child, the one who didn't carry bad luck. David, my mother had whispered, kneeling beside him. We have to choose. Do you want to live to see Mark grow up, or do you want to keep her and die? I waited for him to defend me. I waited for the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who taught me the importance of resilience and loyalty, to tell this charlatan to get out of our house. Instead, he looked at me. His eyes were void of recognition, clouded by pain and fear. He didn't see his daughter. He saw a tumor. Do it, he had rasped. Get her out. The abandonment wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic. They drove me to a state ward 2 towns over, handed over a check to the administrator that was large enough to ensure no questions were asked, and told the staff I was unmanageable and violent. I had nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and my textbooks. I stood on the sidewalk as the black SUV pulled away, watching the taillights fade into the mist. I didn't cry. That was the moment Sophie the child died, and Sophie the scientist was born. I realized then that people lie, emotions lie, parents lie, but data never lies. Biology is ruthlessly honest. If I wanted to survive, I had to become like the data, cold, irrefutable, essential. Dr. Allen, the stage manager's voice snapped me back to the present. The green room reassembled itself. 5 minutes, doctor. They're ready for the reveal. Thank you, I said. My voice was steady. My heart rate was 64 beats per minute. Perfect control. I walked toward the wings of the stage. The noise of the crowd grew louder, a roar of anticipation. I ran through the Allen protocol in my mind. It was a masterpiece of genetic engineering. I had synthesized a viral vector that could rewrite the faulty coding in the HDT4 sequence, but it had a catch. It required a biological anchor plasma from a direct genetic relative to stabilize the edit. Without a donor who shared at least 50% of the patient's DNA, the cure would fail. It was poetic, really. The cure for the disease required the very family connection my parents had severed. I stepped into the light. The glare was blinding. 1,000 camera shutters clicked in unison, sounding like a swarm of cicadas. I walked to the lucite podium, placing my tablet down. I waited for the applause to die down, commanding the room with silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice amplified across the cavernous hall. For decades, hemolytic degeneration type 4 has been a death sentence. It is a thief that steals dignity, strength, and finally life. Doctors told us it was incurable. They said it was written in the code of our being immutable. I paused, leaning into the microphone. But science does not believe in destiny. Science believes in variables. And I have changed the variable. The screen behind me illuminated with the complex double helix structure of the Allen protocol. I began the technical breakdown, explaining the viral vector delivery system. I was in my element. I was the smartest person in the room, the architect of a miracle. I scanned the audience as I spoke, moving my gaze from the journalists in the front row to the medical board in the middle. Then I looked at the VIP section. Etheris had reserved the front left box for compassionate use candidates, wealthy patients petitioning for early access to the trial. I had approved the list of names without looking at them personally, trusting my administrative team. That was a variable I had failed to control. There they were. Time didn't stop, but it seemed to thicken, turning into molasses. In the center of the box sat a man in a motorized wheelchair. He was skeletal, a husk of the man I remembered, oxygen tubes snake-lined across his face. David. Beside him sat a woman in a Chanel suit, her face pulled tight by surgery, but her eyes unmistakably the same cold steel that had watched me get left on a curb. Elena. And next to her, looking bored and scrolling on his phone, was a young man in a tailored suit that cost more than my college tuition. Mark. They were here. They had come for the cure. My breath hitched for a fraction of a second, invisible to the audience, but deafening to me. They were looking right at me. I waited for the shock of recognition. I waited for my mother to gasp, for my father to recoil in shame. But there was nothing. They stared at me with the blank, hungry entitlement of consumers looking at a product. They didn't know who I was. They didn't recognize the 14-year-old girl they had discarded in the face of the celebrated Dr. Allen. To them, I was just a dispenser of life. I was a utility. A cold smile touched the corners of my lips unbidden. The universe, usually chaotic and random, had just aligned in a perfect, terrifying symmetry. They wanted the cure. They needed a genetic match. And they were sitting just 20 feet away from the only person on Earth who could give it to them or deny it. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and felt the final death of my fear. The curse had returned home, but this time she was holding the keys to the kingdom. I continued my speech, my voice ringing out with a newfound power, a steel that surprised even me. However, I said, locking eyes with the oblivious family in the VIP box, science requires sacrifice, and before we can heal, we must first admit the sickness. The trap was set. Have you ever been erased by the people who were supposed to define you? Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own family and seen nothing but strangers? If you have, you know that the deepest scars aren't the ones that bleed, they're the ones that fuel you. Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The applause following my presentation was polite, respectful, and entirely irrelevant to the seismic shift occurring in my own chest. As the clapping faded into the murmur of shifting bodies and typing fingers, the house lights rose slightly, casting a pale interrogation room glow over the audience. The moderator, a polished man named Reynolds from the Etheris Public Relations Department, stepped up to the microphone stand to my right. He smiled the practiced smile of corporate damage control. Thank you, Dr. Allen, for that illuminating presentation. We have time for a brief Q&A regarding the Allen Protocol before we move to the reception. Dozens of hands shot up from the press pool, desperate for the soundbite that would headline the evening news. Is it FDA approved? What is the cost? Can it be weaponized? I ignored them all. My gaze remained fixed on the VIP box locked onto the three people who were currently whispering frantically amongst themselves. I saw Elena gesturing sharply at Mark, her diamond bracelet catching the light, while David slumped in his chair, his head lolling to the side. They were debating whether to leave or stay. Fear versus desperation. I decided to make the choice for them. I stepped out from behind the podium, bypassing Reynolds completely. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the noise without raising in pitch, I believe we have a question from the compassionate use section. The woman in the gray suit. The room turned as one organism. The camera lenses swiveled on their tripods, the motors whirring like insect wings. Elena froze. She had not raised her hand, but in the spotlight she knew the rules of the game better than anyone. To run now would look suspicious. To speak was her only option. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, and instantly the mask descended. The sharp, calculating woman I had watched 5 minutes ago vanished, replaced by the tragic, devoted matriarch. A microphone runner scrambled to the box and handed her the device. "Dr. Allen," she began, her voice trembling with a vibrato that was pitch perfect for television. "My name is Elena. This is my husband, David. We have been fighting HDT4 for 3 years." She paused to wipe a non-existent tear from her cheek. "We have flown to Switzerland, to Tokyo, to specialists who promised us miracles and gave us bills. We have tried everything. My husband is a good man, a pillar of his community. He doesn't deserve this pain." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, playing to the gallery. "We have the means to pay whatever is required. Please, tell us there is hope." It was a masterclass in manipulation. The room was silent, the journalists scribbling furiously about the human element of the story. Reynolds looked at me, nodding encouragingly, seeing a PR goldmine, save the dying father, win the stock market. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at her. "I know you have tried everything, Elena," I said softly. "I know exactly how much you have paid to make problems go away." She blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. The microphone picked up my next words with crystal clarity. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father." The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room. Reynolds dropped his pen. The journalists froze, their hands hovering over their keyboards. Elena's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mark looked up from his phone, his jaw going slack. David, roused by the sound of my voice addressing him directly for the first time in 14 years, lifted his head. He squinted at me through the glare of the stage lights, his breathing laboring against the silence. "Sophie," he wheezed. The name was barely a whisper, but the microphone caught it. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. I could hear the whispers starting, daughter abandonment scandal building like static. This was the tipping point. If I acted with anger, I would be the hysterical woman they had painted me as years ago. I would be the villain withholding the cure. I needed to control the narrative. I needed to be the bigger person. I needed to be American resilience personified. I smiled, a sad, benevolent expression that I had practiced in the mirror for weeks. "Please," I said, gesturing to the stairs on the side of the stage. "Come up here, bring him up." Security hesitated, but I waved them forward. "It's okay, they're family." The word tasted like ash, but the crowd ate it up. A murmur of approval went through the room. "She's reuniting with them. She's saving her father." The narrative was writing itself. The estranged genius daughter returns to save the dying patriarch. It was a Hallmark movie, and I was the director. I watched as the staff helped maneuver the wheelchair up the ramp. Elena walked beside it, looking pale, her eyes darting around the stage like a trapped animal. She was trying to calculate the angle, trying to figure out if I was going to expose her or save her. She decided to bet on my desire for approval. As they reached center stage, she moved to hug me. I sidestepped it smoothly, turning it into a professional handshake, gripping her forearm with just enough pressure to stop her. Her skin was cold. "We're on the clock, Elena. David's vitals are unstable." I turned to the audience, my arm around the back of my father's wheelchair, posing as the dutiful daughter. "You asked about the cost," I said to the crowd, my voice booming. "You asked if this technology is accessible. Let me tell you about the price of survival." I looked down at David. He was staring at my name badge, his eyes watering. Was it regret or just the pain of his dissolving cells? It didn't matter. In this country, we believe in second chances. I continued channeling the rhetoric of a statesman. We believe that community and truth are the bedrock of our society. My parents and I, we have a complicated history. There were misunderstandings, superstitions, mistakes were made that severed our bond. I paused, letting the weight of the vague confession hang there. But science is the great equalizer. Science does not care about the past. It cares about the biological reality of the present. And the reality is, I have the power to save this man. And because I believe in the resilience of the human spirit and the duty we owe to our blood, I am going to treat him right here, right now, for free. The room erupted. People stood up. Flashes fired like lightning. I was a saint. I was a hero. Elena looked ready to faint with relief. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it. Oh, Sophie, thank you. I knew you were special. We always knew. Save the praise for the procedure, I said, pulling my hand away. I turned back to the podium, keying in a command on the console. The giant screen behind us shifted from the double helix to a diagram of a blood transfusion. However, there is a condition, a scientific necessity that cannot be bypassed. I pointed to the diagram. The Allen protocol works by introducing a CRISPR-edited viral vector into the patient's marrow. But the vector is volatile. If introduced alone, the patient's immune system will identify it as a threat and attack it, causing immediate fatal organ failure. To cloak the vector, we need a genetic anchor. I paced the stage, the professor addressing her class. We need plasma from a donor, but not just any donor. It must be a direct vertical genetic match. A parent, a sibling, or a child. The DNA must share at least 50% of the recipient's unique markers to convince the immune system to stand down. Without this genetic anchor, the cure is poison. I turned back to the family. Elena was nodding enthusiastically, not understanding the science, but hearing the solution. Of course, anything. We need a donor, I said, my voice dropping to a clinical register. Someone who shares David's blood. Someone undeniably his. Elena didn't hesitate. Not for a second. She didn't look at me. She didn't offer herself, knowing she wasn't a blood relation. She turned immediately to Mark. Mark, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, adjusting his silk tie, suddenly found himself the center of attention. He looked like a deer in headlights. He was 25, soft from a life of inherited wealth, with David's nose and Elena's chin, or so they had always claimed. Mark, Elena said, her voice loud and clear. She pushed him forward. Mark is his son. He's the perfect match. Use him. Mark stammered. Sure. I mean, if it hurts, I don't know if I... It's just a blood draw, Mark, I said, smiling at him. A pint of plasma to save your father's life? Surely you can handle a needle. Of course he can. Elena snapped, desperate to seal the deal before I changed my mind. He's his father's son. He's strong. I looked at David. David, do you consent to Mark being the donor? It has to be a biological child. If there is any doubt... There's no doubt, David wheezed, looking at Mark with a mixture of pride and desperation. He's my boy, my heir. Use him. The trap snapped shut with a satisfying metallic click in my mind. They had walked right into it. They were so confident in their lie, a lie they had maintained for 25 years, that they had forgotten that DNA doesn't understand family secrets. They assumed that because Mark had the name, he had the blood. "Excellent," I said. Nurse, a medical technician who I had prepped beforehand for a live demonstration, rolled a cart onto the stage. It held a phlebotomy kit and a sleek silver machine the size of a microwave, the rapid sequence DNA verifier. It was Atheris's crowning jewel, capable of mapping familial matches in under 3 minutes. "We need to verify the match compatibility before we extract the plasma," I explained to the audience, who were watching with bated breath. "Standard safety protocol. We will take a buccal swab from the patient David and the donor Mark. The machine will confirm the paternity match and the genetic compatibility percentage. Once the green light appears, we proceed with the cure." I handed a swab to the nurse. She swabbed the inside of David's cheek. He sat still, eyes closed, perhaps praying. Then she turned to Mark. "Open wide," I said. Mark opened his mouth. The swab collected the cells that would dismantle their entire world. The nurse placed both samples into the cartridges and slotted them into the machine. "Processing," the automated voice of the machine announced. A loading bar appeared on the giant screen behind us, massive and pixelated. 0%, 10%, 20%. The room was silent. The only sound was the humming of the sequencer fans. Elena stood with her hand on Mark's shoulder, looking triumphant. She thought she had won. She thought she had secured the cure and kept the secret. She had no idea that I had run the probability models. I knew about her affair with her tennis instructor. The year Mark was conceived, a rumor in the town that I had investigated with a private detective 6 months ago. I had the paper trail, but paper can be denied. Paper can be burned. But a live DNA test in front of the global press, that is indelible. I stood back, clasping my hands behind my back, watching the numbers climb. 80%, 90%, just a few more seconds. I said, my voice calm, contrasting the frantic beating of my own heart. "And then we will see the truth." Have you ever watched someone confident in a lie walk straight into a wall of truth? Have you ever held a secret that was about to change everything? It's a heavy burden, but dropping it can be explosive. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The loading bar on the massive LED screen hovered at 99%, a single pulsating pixel of white light holding the breath of 300 people hostage. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy enough to crush a lung. I could hear the hum of the server banks backstage, the high-pitched whine of the camera capacitors charging, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man in the wheelchair. David was staring at the screen with the intensity of a man on trial, awaiting a verdict, his hand gripping Mark's wrist. Elena was smiling, a tight rictus grin that didn't reach her eyes, already rehearsing her victory speech for the cameras. She thought this was a formality. She thought biology was a negotiation she could win with confidence and money. But biology is a dictator. It does not bargain. "Analysis complete," the machine announced. The voice was synthesized, devoid of judgment, but the words struck the room like a gavel. The screen flickered, shifting from the soothing blue of the processing interface to a stark, unforgiving black background. Red text 5 feet high slashed across the display. Subject B. Mark paternity exclusion. Genetic match with subject. A David 0.00% status. No biological relation detected. The gasp that tore through the room was visceral. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sudden drop in air pressure. 1,000 eyes shifted from the screen to the stage, their gaze physically heavy. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The data hung above us, glowing undeniable. Elena was the first to break. No. Her scream was shrill, cracking the tension. She lunged toward the nurse, grabbing the machine. It's broken. The machine is broken. Reset it. You did it wrong. Mrs. Allen, I said, my voice amplified and calm, cutting through her panic like a laser. The rapid sequence verifier has an error margin of less than 1 in a billion. It is more accurate than your memory. It is more accurate than your marriage license. It's a lie, Elena shrieked, turning to the cameras, waving her hands frantically. She rigged it, don't you see? She hates us. She's jealous of her brother. She programmed it to say that. David wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at Mark. He was looking at the young man. He had raised the boy he had chosen over his own daughter, the heir he had groomed to take over his legacy. Slowly, painfully, David pulled his hand away from Mark's wrist as if he had been burned. Mark, David whispered. The word was a question, a plea, and an accusation all at once. Mark was frozen. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax statue. He looked at the screen, then at his mother, then at David. "Mom?" he stammered. What does that mean? Why does it say 0? It's a mistake," Elena insisted, grabbing David's shoulder. "David, look at him. He has your nose. He has your temper. He is your son. Phenotypes can be deceptive," I interjected, stepping closer to the group. "Brown hair and brown eyes are common traits, Elena, but genetic markers, those are fingerprints. And Mark's fingerprints don't belong to David. They belong to someone else." I let the implication hang there heavy and suffocating. Perhaps a tennis instructor or a business partner. I'm sure the private investigators digging into the timeline right now will find the answer by the morning edition. David turned his head slowly toward his wife. The shock was giving way to a dawning, horrific comprehension. The pieces of the last 25 years were rearranging themselves in his mind. The coldness in their marriage, the way Elena had always been so protective of Mark, the way she had pushed Sophie out the moment Mark was born. "You lied," David rasped. It wasn't a question. "I didn't," Elena cried, tears streaming down her face, now ruining her makeup. "She's doing this to destroy us. She's the curse, remember? The curse. Madame Hecate said she was evil. She's using her science to twist reality." "Ah, yes," I said, nodding. "The curse. The convenient supernatural explanation for why you needed to get rid of a healthy, observant 14-year-old girl who was starting to look a little too much like her father. The girl who was a living reminder of the husband you were betraying." I turned to the stage manager in the wings and signaled, "Since we are discussing the curse that justified my abandonment, and since Elena is questioning the validity of my science, I thought it only fair to bring in a second opinion, an expert on the spiritual matter." The heavy curtains parted. A woman walked out. She wasn't wearing the flowing purple robes or the heavy amulets she had worn 14 years ago. There was no crystal ball, no incense. She was wearing a beige cardigan and orthopedic shoes. She looked small, frail, and ordinary. She looked like a grandmother you would pass in the supermarket. Elena stopped screaming. Her face went slack. Her hands fell to her sides. "Hello, Martha," I said gently. The woman walked to the microphone I offered her. She looked at the crowd, blinking in the harsh lights, terrified. She looked at Elena, then quickly looked away, shame burning her cheeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "you may know her as Madame Hecate, the mystic who diagnosed my negative aura 14 years ago. But her name is Martha Higgins. She used to run a faltering palm reading shop in the strip mall on 4th Street. Martha, would you like to tell the audience about the curse?" Martha's voice shook. There was no curse. The murmur in the crowd rose again, an angry tide. "Speak up, please," I said. "There was no curse?" Martha cried out, her voice cracking. "I didn't see any aura. I didn't see any vampires." She pointed a trembling finger at Elena. "She came to my shop. She offered me $5,000 cash. She said she needed a reason to get the girl out of the house. She said the girl was too sharp, asked too many questions. She said the husband, David, was weak, and if a spiritualist told him the girl was killing him, he would believe it." "Liar!" Elena lunged at Martha, but security intercepted her, holding her back. "I paid you for a consultation. You said she was evil." "You wrote the script, Mrs. Allen," Martha sobbed. "You told me exactly what to say. You told me to say she was draining his life force. I needed the money. My rent was due. I didn't know you were going to dump her at a state ward. I thought you were just sending her to boarding school." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He slumped in his wheelchair, the fight draining out of him instantly. The monitor monitoring his vitals began to beep erratically, a fast, frantic rhythm. Beep, 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 beep. "You paid her," David whispered, staring at the floor. "You paid a stranger to lie to me, to make me throw away my daughter." He looked up at Elena, his eyes wet and red. "And you gave me him." He gestured vaguely at Mark. "A stranger's son? You made me disown my own blood for a lie." Mark was backing away, shaking his head. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Don't call me that," David said. The voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. "I am not your father." Mark flinched as if he'd been slapped. He looked at Elena, his face twisting into betrayal. "Mom, is it true? Who is he who is my father?" Elena was cornered. The lie she had built her entire life around, the fortress of deceit that secured her lifestyle, her status, her son's inheritance, had been disintegrated by a single blood test and an old woman's confession. She looked around the room, searching for an ally, but found only the cold, unblinking lenses of the cameras. She was exposed. The devoted wife was dead. The victim was dead. All that was left was the architect of her family's ruin. "I did it for us," Elena screamed, her voice breaking into hysteria. "He was boring, David. You were always working, and then you got sick. I needed insurance. Mark was my insurance. And she jabbed a finger at me. She was always watching me with those judgy little eyes. Just like you, I couldn't have her in the house. She would have figured it out. So you made me an orphan?" I said, my voice dead calm, "to cover your affair." "I did what I had to do to survive," Elena spat. "And now," I replied, "so must I." I turned to the audience. "You have seen the data. You have heard the testimony. The curse was a fabrication. The heir is a biological stranger. The wife is a fraud." I walked over to the medical cart and picked up the single bag of clear fluid, the viral vector. The cure. "The science is clear," I said, holding the bag up to the light. "This cure requires a genetic anchor. It requires a biological match. Mark cannot provide it. Elena cannot provide it." I looked down at David. He was gasping now, clutching his chest. The stress of the revelation was triggering a systemic crash. The monitors were screaming. His heart rate is spiking, the nurse said, her voice rising in panic. Dr. Allen, he's going into cardiac arrest. If we don't stabilize him with the treatment immediately, his organs will shut down. He has maybe 4 minutes. The room spun into chaos. Journalists were standing on chairs. Flashbulbs were blinding. Do something, Mark yelled at me, tears running down his face. Save him, even if he's not, even if he hates me. Save him. I can't, I said, my voice projecting over the noise. The protocol dictates a donor. Without a donor, the injection kills him instantly. I looked at David. He wasn't looking at Elena anymore. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was looking at me. He was dying, and for the first time in 14 years, he was seeing me. Not the curse, not the monster, but the only thing that was real. Sophie, he gasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. Please. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an order from a father to a child. It was a beg from a dying man to a stranger who held the power of a god. I stood there, the bag of medicine in my hand. I had planned this moment for years. I had imagined watching him die, crushed by the weight of his own errors. It was supposed to be sweet. It was supposed to be the ultimate validation of my pain. But as I looked at the wreckage of my family, the screaming mother, the shattered brother, the dying father, I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold, hard weight of the choice. I was the only variable left in the equation. Dr. Allen, the nurse shouted, BP is dropping 60/40. We are losing him. The cameras zoomed in on my face. The world was watching. The revenge was complete. The truth was out. He knew what he had done. He knew what he had lost. Justice had been served. Now came the question of mercy. The alarm on the cardiac monitor was no longer a rhythmic warning. It was a continuous flatline drone that sliced through the panic of the room. Beep. It was the sound of a system crashing, of biological machinery grinding to a halt. The nurse, a woman named Sarah, who I had worked with for 3 years, looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her hands hovered over the crash cart, paralyzed by the unique horror of the situation. She had the medicine. She had the technology, but she didn't have the key. Dr. Allen, she shouted, her voice cracking. He's in ventricular tachycardia. We're losing him. I need a donor. I need a match now. I stood motionless at the center of the storm. To my left, Elena was sobbing into her hands, a crumpled heap of Chanel and regret. To my right, Mark was staring at his own hands as if they were foreign objects, paralyzed by the sudden annihilation of his identity. And in the chair, David was gasping like a fish on a dock, his chest heaving, his eyes rolling back. The crowd was silent. The cameras were zooming in. This was the narrative climax they hadn't expected. They were watching a man die live on stage, killed not by the disease, but by the lie he had told to hide it. He's going to die, a journalist whispered in the front row. The acoustics of the room were so perfect, I heard it clearly. It would be easy. God, it would be so easy. I could just stand here. I could let the seconds tick by. I could let biology take its course. It would be justice. It would be the perfect symmetrical ending to the tragedy they wrote 14 years ago. They threw me away to save him. Now, because they threw me away, he would die. It was scientifically elegant. It was karmic. But as I looked at David's face, a face that was turning a terrifying shade of cyanotic blue, I realized something. If I let him die, I was just reacting. I was just another variable in Elena's chaotic experiment. I would be the monster she claimed I was, the vampire sucking the life from the father. I looked at the bag of viral vector hanging on the IV pole. I looked at the empty donor chair next to David. My parents failed to protect me. I said, my voice low, but picked up by the lapel mic broadcasting my internal monologue to the world. They failed the most basic evolutionary imperative to nurture their offspring. They chose superstition over blood. I took a step toward the chair. But I am a scientist. I continued walking past the sobbing mother and the frozen brother. And a scientist does not destroy data just because the results are painful. We do not discard life just because it is inconvenient. I reached the donor chair and sat down. The leather was cold against my back. Nurse, I said, my voice snapping with authority. Prep my left arm, use an 18-gauge needle. I have excellent venous access. Sarah blinked stunned. Dr. Allen, but we haven't run your sequence. I ran my sequence 15 years ago in high school biology, I said, rolling up the sleeve of my lab coat. I am his daughter. I am the only biological child of David Allen. I am the 50% match. I am the anchor. I looked at the crowd. There is no curse. There is only DNA. And DNA is the only thing in this room that isn't lying. The room erupted into a low murmur, a wave of awe and disbelief. The outcast, the cursed child, the abandoned daughter. I was the only thing standing between David and the grave. Sarah snapped into action. She was a professional. She tied the tourniquet around my bicep. I pumped my fist, watching the vein rise, the same blue vein that ran under my father's skin. She swabbed the area with alcohol. The smell was sharp, stinging, and clean. This is going to hurt, Sarah whispered. Good, I said. She slid the needle in. I didn't flinch. I watched the dark red blood fill the tube flowing out of me through the machine, mixing with the viral vector and traveling down the clear plastic line toward David. The monitor was still screaming. Beep. Connect the line, I ordered. Sarah connected the output to David's IV port. Now came the wait, the biological lag time. I looked at David. His eyes had fluttered open. He was conscious barely. He was too weak to speak, too weak to move, but he could see. He turned his head, fighting the gravity that tried to pull him into darkness. He saw the tube. He saw the red line connecting us. He saw his life flowing from my arm into his. The irony was not lost on him. I saw it register in his dilated pupils. The bad blood, the blood he was told was poison. The blood he was told would kill him. It was the only thing keeping his heart beating. Slowly, agonizingly, the monitor changed its tune. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm returned. It was erratic, weak, but it was there. His blood pressure began to climb. 70/40, 80/50. The color began to return to his cheeks, replacing the deathly gray with a faint living pink. Stabilizing, Sarah breathed, checking the readouts. Rejection markers are negative. The anchor is holding. The vector is integrating. I sat there tethered to the man who had abandoned me, pumping life into the body that had rejected me. I felt a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness is an emotion. This was a transaction. I was buying his life so he would have to live with the truth. If he died today, he died a victim in his own mind. By saving him, I forced him to wake up tomorrow and face the reality of what he had done. I forced him to look at Mark and see a stranger. I forced him to look at Elena and see a liar. and I forced him to look at me and see his savior. That was the true revenge, survival. I looked over at Elena. She had stopped crying. She was staring at the tube of blood connecting us, her face a mask of absolute defeat. She knew in that moment that she had lost everything. Her control, her narrative, her leverage, it was all gone. She had paid a fortune teller to break this bond, and science had just welded it back together with steel and plasma. "He's going to make it," Sarah announced, her voice trembling with relief. "Vitals are normalizing. The crisis has passed." I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just watched the blood flow. "You're welcome," I whispered, not to him, but to the universe. David's hand, frail and trembling, moved on the armrest of his wheelchair. He reached out his fingers, inching across the gap between our chairs. He wasn't reaching for Elena. He was reaching for me. He wanted to touch the arm that was saving him. I didn't pull away. I didn't take his hand either. I just let him rest his fingertips on my wrist right above the needle. He needed to feel the pulse. He needed to feel the truth. We sat there for 20 minutes while the transfusion completed a tableau of broken things being held together by medical tubing. The cameras never stopped flashing, capturing the image that would be on every front page tomorrow. The scientist's daughter saving the father who didn't want her. It was the ultimate American story of redemption, but only I knew the cost. Finally, the bag was empty. Sarah disconnected the line. She bandaged my arm. I stood up feeling a little lightheaded, not from blood loss, but from the sheer weight of the moral high ground. "Take him to the recovery suite," I ordered. "Start him on the post-op immunosuppressants. I want a full security detail at his door. No visitors, especially not family." I looked at Elena and Mark. "Until I clear it." I buttoned my lab coat covering the bandage. I turned to the audience, who were now standing giving a thunderous ovation. They were cheering for the miracle. They were cheering for the love. I walked to the front of the stage, took the microphone, and looked into the camera lens. "We often think that strength comes from cutting ties," I said, my voice echoing in the hall. "From removing the things that hurt us. But sometimes true strength is forcing the broken pieces back together, not to fix the past, but to ensure the future tells the truth." I dropped the mic. It didn't screech. It landed with a dull thud. I walked off stage, leaving my family in the wreckage of their own making, alive but utterly undone. Making the choice to save someone who hurt you is perhaps the hardest thing a human being can do. It goes against every instinct for revenge, yet it is the ultimate proof of character. Have you ever had to be the bigger person when every fiber of your being wanted to walk away? It's a lonely, difficult road. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. 3 months is the standard clinical window for assessing the long-term viability of a genetic graft. In the lab, we call it the integration phase, the period where the foreign biological material stops being an invader and becomes part of the host's fundamental architecture. If the body doesn't reject the change by 90 days, the cure is permanent. As I drove up the winding gravel driveway of the Connecticut estate I hadn't visited in 14 years, I found myself analyzing the landscape with the same clinical detachment. The oak trees were older, their branches heavier. The hedges were trimmed with the same obsessive precision. But the atmosphere, the invisible pressure that used to crush the air out of the foyer, had dissipated. The curse had been lifted not by burning sage, but by burning the lies that had sustained it. Mark was waiting for me on the porch. He looked different. The arrogance of the golden child had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative humility. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, looking younger than his 25 years. Since the revelation at the press conference, the dynamic between us had shifted from strangers to fellow survivors. We were both victims of the same deception, just on opposite ends of the spectrum. I was the child discarded to protect the lie. He was the child manufactured to sustain it. Dr. Allen, he said, a small, tentative smile playing on his lips as I stepped out of the car. Sophie, I corrected him, returning the smile. How is he? Stubborn, Mark replied, walking down the steps to meet me. The physical therapist left an hour ago. He's insisting on doing the extra sets. He wants to walk to the garden by himself before the snow comes. We walked into the house together. The silence inside was peaceful, no longer heavy with secrets. In the living room, I saw Elena. She was sitting by the window reading a book. She looked smaller somehow. The sharp edges of her personality, the frantic need to control every variable in the room, had been eroded by the public humiliation and the subsequent restructuring of the family dynamic. She didn't run the house anymore. She was a guest in it, attending weekly therapy sessions as a condition of David not filing for divorce. It was a fragile truce held together by the fact that she had nowhere else to go, and David in his old age didn't have the energy to hate her as much as he should. She looked up, saw me, and gave a stiff, polite nod. There was no warmth, but there was no venom either. She had been neutralized. I found David in the sunroom. The winter light flooded the space, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was standing between parallel bars, his knuckles white as he gripped the steel. He was thinner than the man I remembered from my childhood, but the gray pallor of HDT4 was gone, replaced by a healthy, flushed complexion. My blood was doing its work. My cells were in his marrow, manufacturing the proteins he needed to survive. He was literally living on borrowed time, my time. He heard my footsteps and stopped breathing heavily. He didn't turn around immediately. The doctors say my red blood cell count is normal, he said to the glass window. They say I have the blood of a 28-year-old. You do, I said, stepping closer. Use it wisely. He turned slowly, leaning heavily on the bars, his eyes clear and sharp, locked onto mine. There was no confusion today, no fever dream haze. I didn't think you would come, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I needed to check the data, I said, keeping my tone light to mask the tightness in my throat. I have a reputation to maintain. David shook his head. You always were a terrible liar, Sophie, even when you were 10. He let go of one of the bars and shuffled a step toward me. I sat in this room 14 years ago and let her convince me you were death. I was so afraid of dying. Pain makes you a coward. It makes you irrational. Fear is a powerful variable, I acknowledged. It overrides logic. It wasn't just fear, David corrected, his gaze unwavering. It was weakness. It was easier to believe a fortune teller than to confront the fact that my wife was unhappy and my body was failing. I chose the easy lie over the hard truth. And it cost me my daughter. Tears pooled in his eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. I am so sorry, Sophie. I can't give you back those 14 years. I can't undo the loneliness. But I want you to know that every breath I take now, I know who gave it to me. The apology didn't fix the past. It didn't erase the nights I spent in the state ward, wondering why I wasn't enough. But it did something else. It balanced the equation. It acknowledged the debt. I didn't do it for an apology. Dad, I said softly the word, feeling strange, but right in my mouth. I did it because the world needs to know that truth is stronger than superstition, and because, despite everything, you're still my father. Biology is stubborn like that. He let out a watery laugh. He tried to take a step toward me, away from the safety of the bars, but his leg buckled. It was a moment of pure vulnerability. He was going to fall. I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, closing the distance in a heartbeat. I caught him by the elbows, my grip firm and steady. He grabbed my forearms, his weight sagging against me. "I've got you," I whispered. "I know," he said, gripping me tight. "You always did." We stood there in the sunroom, the scientist and the patient, the abandoned daughter and the repentant father held together by gravity and genetics. The curse was broken. The data was correct. The system had returned to homeostasis. Healing a broken relationship is rarely a straight line. It's often a series of painful adjustments and hard truths. It requires us to put down our defenses and let the other person see our scars. It isn't easy, and sometimes it isn't even fair. But the peace on the other side is worth the struggle. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Sophie proves that while lies may sprint, the truth eventually catches up to balance the equation. Have you ever had to be the bigger person in the face of family betrayal, or held a secret that changed everything? Don't be shy to share your thoughts below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.